Picture a man standing in a room you have never been allowed to enter. No gospel says he was there, but that room was tended every day of the year, so the odds are somebody was, and this is what the afternoon would have looked like from inside. He is a priest, and it is late afternoon, and his job right now is ordinary. He is tending the golden altar where incense burns. The room is not large. There is a lampstand to his left throwing steady light, a table of bread to his right, and the smell of smoke that is soaked into these walls for as long as anyone can remember. And in front of him hangs a curtain. He has never been through it. He never will be. One man goes through that curtain, one day a year, and this priest is not that man and this is not that day. So he does what he has always done. He works with his back half turned to it, the way you learn to work beside something you are not supposed to look at too long. Then the ground shakes, and behind him, from the top down, the curtain splits. That is the moment. 3 of the 4 Gospels record it, in almost the same words. And behold, the veil of the temple was rent in twain from the top to the bottom. It is one of the most preached sentences in the New Testament. You have probably heard a sermon on it. You may have heard several. Here is the part almost nobody mentions from a pulpit. The temple in Jerusalem had more than one great curtain. Deep inside the sanctuary, a curtain stood in front of the most holy place, where the presence of God was said to dwell. Nobody saw that curtain except priests, and nobody passed it except the high priest once a year on the Day of Atonement. The majority tradition preserved in the Mishnah says there were actually 2 of them hanging there, about a cubit apart, though one rabbi in the same discussion remembered only one. And at the entrance of the sanctuary, building itself hung another curtain entirely, an enormous one, where people standing in the courts could see it. Matthew does not tell you which one tore. Neither does Mark. Neither does Luke. All 3 of them use the same phrase, and that phrase fits both curtains, and every English Bible you own leaves the question exactly where the Greek leaves it. Open. This is not a translation problem, and it is not a detail invented by scholars looking for something to argue about. This is a story about curtains, 2 very different meanings, and a sentence that has been quoted for 2,000 years by people who mostly did not know there was a choice. And there is one more wrinkle waiting for us. One of the greatest scholars of the ancient church says he read a Jewish Christian gospel, now lost, which did not say the curtain tore at all. It said something else broke that afternoon, something made of stone. We will get to what he wrote, but not yet. Start with the curtain nobody could see. Its Hebrew name is parocheth. You meet it first in the book of Exodus, in the instructions for the tabernacle in the wilderness, long before there was a temple at all. Make a veil, God tells Moses, of blue and purple and scarlet, and fine twined linen. Work cherubim into it, hang it on 4 pillars. And then the sentence that gives it its whole purpose. The veil shall divide for you between the holy place and the most holy. Read that again. Its job was to divide, not to soften a room or to mark an occasion, but to separate one space from another and to make the separation absolute. Behind it sat the ark. In front of it stood everything else. And the message was carried by the fabric itself, because those cherubim, woven into the cloth, are the same creatures set at the east of Eden with a flaming sword to keep the way of the tree of life. The curtain was a guard post rendered in thread. Every time a priest looked at it, he was looking at the reason he could not go further. Centuries later, when Solomon built the temple, he made the same thing in permanent form, blue and purple and crimson and fine linen, with cherubim on it. And the rule around it did not soften with time. It hardened. One man, one day a year, carrying blood in a very specific set of instructions, because the God on the other side of that cloth was not safe, and everybody involved knew it. Picture the day itself, because the details will tell you more than any explanation. The high priest washes. He puts aside the gold and the color he normally wears, and puts on plain white linen, because on this one day he goes in as a man, and not as a dignitary. Then he carries a fire pan of coals and incense through the curtain. The blood comes later, in a separate entry. The rites are ordered carefully, one stage at a time, and the ordering is part of the point. Outside, the courts are full of people who cannot see any of it. All they can do is wait. And the Mishnah preserves one small human detail about what he did in there. He kept his prayers short, so that Israel would not become alarmed that something had happened to him. Read that again. The rule was not about eloquence. It was about the fear of the people standing outside, who had no way of knowing what was going on behind the cloth, and would start to imagine the worst if he took too long. That is what the inner curtain meant to the people standing in those courts. It did not represent distance. It was distance. You could stand 100 feet from the presence of God, on the holiest ground your people owned, on the holiest day of your year, and still be on the outside of a piece of fabric you would never in your life pass through. Now hold that beside the other curtain. The Jewish historian Josephus saw the temple with his own eyes before Rome destroyed it, and he wrote a description of the outer curtain that is worth having in full detail because it changes how you picture this. He says it was a Babylonian curtain, embroidered in blue and fine linen and scarlet and purple, and that the mixture of colors had meaning: the scarlet for fire, the linen for earth, the blue for air, the purple for the sea. And then he says something you will want to remember for later. That curtain, he says, had embroidered on it a picture of the heavens. Not a decorative pattern, but the sky itself, worked in colored thread across a curtain that Josephus puts at 55 cubits, which lands somewhere north of 70 feet depending on how you convert it. It hung at the entrance of the sanctuary, in front of the golden doors where people standing in the courts could see it. Think about what that would have meant for an ordinary pilgrim. You walk up to Jerusalem for the feast, having saved for the trip, maybe once in your life. You come through the gates into the crowds, and the noise and the smell of animals, and then you look up, and filling the front of the sanctuary is a wall of colored cloth, taller than any building in your village, with the sky worked into it in thread. And that was the last thing you would have seen before the part of the building you were not allowed into. So you have two very different kinds of cloth. The one inside was guarded by woven angels and marked the line, "No ordinary person crossed." The one outside was public and enormous, and it showed the heavens to anybody who came to worship. Which one was it? Here is where the Greek gets interesting, and I want to be careful, because this is exactly the kind of detail people overstate. The word all three gospel writers use is Katapetasma. In the Greek Old Testament, the translation the earliest Christians actually read, Katapetasma, is the standard word for the inner veil, the parocheth. So the inner reading has real linguistic weight behind it. But the word does not settle the question, and this is the part that usually gets left out. Josephus uses that same word, Katapetasma, for the enormous outer curtain hanging before the golden doors of the temple he had seen with his own eyes. That one sentence changes the shape of the whole argument. Scripture points the word inward. The most detailed first-century description of the actual building, written by a man who walked past it, points the same word outward. Vocabulary alone cannot tell us which curtain Matthew meant. Both uses of the word have to stay on the table. Pay attention to one more thing about the wording, because it is the kind of detail that survives translation, and almost nobody notices it. The three Gospels do not agree on when it happened. Matthew and Mark both put the tearing after the death. The man cries out, he dies, and then the curtain splits. Luke puts it before. In his account, the sun is darkened, the veil of the temple is rent in the midst, and only then does Jesus speak his last words and die. That is not a contradiction anyone needs to panic about. Ancient writers ordered events for meaning as often as for the clock, and Luke is grouping the signs together before the death rather than after it. But it does tell you something. Three writers had this detail. All three thought it belonged in the account, and not one of them treated its exact position or its exact location in the building as the point they were making. There is a second Greek detail underneath that one, and it narrows things further. Matthew does not write that the veil of the temple complex tore. He writes naos, the word for the sanctuary building itself, the structure with the holy place inside it, as opposed to hieron, which covers the whole site with its courts and colonnades and money changers. Whatever tore was attached to the building proper. That rules out a great deal, and it still does not decide between our two candidates because both curtains belong to the naos. One hung at its door, one hung inside it. And the letter to the Hebrews takes it in exactly that direction. It speaks of the hope that enters into that within the veil. It describes the second tabernacle behind the second veil. And then it tells its readers they have boldness to enter into the holiest by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way which he consecrated for us, through the veil, that is to say, his flesh. Through the veil. The writer of Hebrews is standing at the inner curtain, and he is saying the way through it is open now. One caution before you bank it. Hebrews never says which curtain tore in the gospel account, and it never mentions that afternoon at all. What it does is develop the meaning of the inner veil, at length and on purpose. That is a serious argument, and for most of church history it has been the ordinary reading. When your pastor says the veil tearing means access to God is open, he is reading the inner curtain, and he is standing in a very old tradition. If these walks through Scripture are worth your time, take 1 second and subscribe. It genuinely tells me to keep making them. Now the case on the other side, because it is stronger than most people expect, start with a simple question. If the inner curtain tore, who saw it? Not the crowds, and not the disciples, and not the women watching from a distance outside the city. That curtain was behind a wall, inside a building, In a room only priests entered. A tear there would have been witnessed by a handful of men on duty, and by nobody else on earth, which does not make it impossible. It makes it a story that had to travel a particular way, and remarkably, the New Testament gives you the road it could have traveled. In the book of Acts, as the church in Jerusalem grows, Luke drops one line almost in passing. A great company of the priests were obedient to the faith. Priests joined. Men who had served inside that building were sitting in Christian gatherings within a few years. If something happened behind that wall, those are the men who would know, and those are the men who would say so. But it gets stranger, because the outer curtain has an argument the inner one cannot match. Look at where Matthew puts this sentence. It sits in the middle of a run of public signs, darkness over the land, the earth shaking, rocks splitting, tombs coming open in the hillsides, a Roman officer looking up and saying something he had no business saying. Every other item on that list is a thing people outside the walls could see with their own eyes. The outer curtain fits that list. The inner one does not. And there is a detail in the phrasing that almost never gets pointed out. All three Gospels say the tear ran from the top to the bottom. The Greek behind from the top is anōthen, which is the same word that tangled Nicodemus in the 3rd chapter of John, where it can mean again or from above. Here it means from the upper part. But readers have noticed for a very long time that the direction is doing work either way. Whatever tore that cloth started at the height no human hand could reach and came down. Nobody in that building was tall enough to start that tear. The last piece of evidence comes from outside the Bible entirely, from Jewish tradition rather than Christian. A Talmudic passage, compiled centuries later, records a memory that in the 40 years before the temple was destroyed, strange things happened in it. The lot cast on the Day of Atonement stopped coming up in the right hand. The crimson thread that was supposed to turn white no longer turned white. The westernmost lamp of the lampstand would not stay lit, and the heavy doors of the sanctuary opened by themselves at night. 40 years before the destruction lands you right around the time we are talking about. Now, I am going to hedge this hard, because it gets quoted carelessly all the time. That passage never mentions a torn curtain, and it never mentions Jesus. It was written down long after the events, by people with no interest whatsoever in supporting a Christian claim. What it tells you is not that the gospel account is confirmed. It tells you that the memory of that temple, in its final decades, included a sense that something in the machinery had gone wrong. Two very different communities preserved a feeling that the building stopped working properly before it stopped standing. Which brings us to the thing I promised you at the start. In the 4th century, a scholar named Jerome sat down to translate the Bible into Latin, and he was unusual among the church fathers because he could read Hebrew and he went looking for old material other people ignored. Among the texts he says he handled was a gospel used by Jewish Christians, written in a Semitic language, which has since been lost completely. Every scrap we have of it survives only in quotations by men like him, so we cannot date it and we cannot check him. And Jerome writes, more than once, that in that gospel the account of this moment is different. It does not say the curtain tore, it says the lintel of the temple, a stone beam of immense size, broke and split apart. Sit with that for a second. At least one Jewish Christian tradition, preserved by Jerome from a lost Semitic gospel, remembered the damage differently. Not as a torn curtain, as the collapse of an enormous stone lintel above the temple entrance. I am not telling you that version is correct. We do not have the text. We have one man's report of a book nobody has seen for 1600 years, and Jerome had his own reasons for hunting down old readings. But you should feel what it does to the picture. Somewhere in the ancient church, people were not working from a single tidy sentence about a curtain. They were holding on to different pieces of a violent afternoon, and the pieces did not all match. And now the piece that pulls all of this together, which I find the most remarkable thing in the whole question, go back to what Josephus said was embroidered on the outer curtain. The heavens. Now open the Gospel of Mark at the very beginning, at the baptism, where Jesus comes up out of the water. Mark says the heavens were torn open, and the Spirit descended on him. Torn, not opened. Matthew and Luke both write that the heavens were opened at the baptism. Mark chooses a harder, more violent word, schizo, the word you use for ripping cloth. And Mark uses that word exactly twice in his entire Gospel. Once at the beginning, when the heavens are torn open at the baptism, and once at the very end, when the curtain is torn at the death. In the early 1990s, a scholar named David Ulansey published a short article arguing that this is not an accident. If the outer curtain carried an image of the sky, then Mark has built a frame around his whole gospel. It opens with the heavens ripping apart over a man standing in a river. It closes with a picture of the heavens ripping apart over a man hanging on a cross. Same verb. And in both scenes, the movement runs from above downward. At the baptism, the Spirit comes down. At the death, the curtain tears from the top. The barrier between God and people is ripped open at the beginning and ripped open again at the end, and everything Jesus does happens inside that frame. I want to be honest about the limits of that. The frame is tightest in Mark, because Mark is the one who uses the same word in both places. Our verse is Matthew, and Matthew writes that the heavens were opened at the baptism, so the echo in his gospel is quieter. And the argument depends on Josephus being right about what was embroidered on that cloth. But if it holds, then the answer to which veil is not a piece of trivia. It changes the sentence from a statement about temple architecture into a statement about the sky. And here's where it stops being ancient. Think about a door in a building you know that you have walked past 1,000 times and never opened because it was not yours to open. Maybe it was a room in a house you grew up in. Maybe it was an office where decisions got made about your life without you in it. You know exactly how you learned to walk past that door. You did not stop and stare. You kept your eyes forward, the way people do. Now imagine walking past one afternoon and finding it standing open, not unlocked. Open, frame empty, the room beyond it lit. That is the feeling under this verse, whichever curtain you land on. Something that was closed for as long as anyone could remember stopped being closed, and it did not stop because somebody worked out how to force it. It came apart from the top. So, where does that leave you? The text is genuinely ambiguous, and you should hold both readings with an open hand. The vocabulary and the letter to the Hebrews lean toward the inner curtain, the one that guarded the most holy place. The public setting, the list of signs around it, and the picture embroidered on the cloth lean toward the outer one. Careful readers have landed on both sides for centuries, and neither group is being careless with Scripture. And you do not have to settle it to get the meaning, because both readings arrive at the same place from different directions. If it was the inner curtain, the barrier between God and people came down. If it was the outer curtain, the heavens themselves were shown ripping open. One is about access, the other is about the sky. Neither one is small, and neither one leaves the world where it was that morning. But here is the part I keep coming back to, and there is a reason nobody can go and check. Within about 40 years of that afternoon, Roman legions burned the sanctuary and pulled the site apart, and both curtains went with it. No fragment survives. No drawing made from life survives. Everything we have is a handful of sentences from men who saw the building before it fell, and 3 short gospel lines that do not specify. The question was decidable once, by anyone who was there. Then it stopped being decidable forever, and it happened inside a single lifetime. Whichever curtain it was, somebody had to sew it. Somebody chose the blue and the scarlet, and worked the meaning into the cloth by hand, cherubim on the inner veil of the Scriptures. The heavens on the outer one Josephus saw, and hung the whole enormous weight of it up, and that fabric did its job for generations. It kept people out. That was the point. It was doing exactly what it was made to do. Right up until the afternoon it stopped. And it did not wear out, and it did not fall. In Matthew and Mark it was torn from the top at the moment a man outside the walls stopped breathing. If you have ever felt like the person standing in the outer court, that is worth sitting with. You may know exactly what it is to be near something and not admitted to it, to be in the building but not in the room, to be told in 100 quiet ways that the good part is for other people and your job is to wait outside and listen for footsteps. Some of you learned that in a family. Some of you learned it in a church, which is worse. The claim, underneath this verse, is not that you have been given a better seat in the outer court. It is that the thing keeping you out came apart, and that it came apart from a height you could never have reached yourself. You did not tear it. You were not asked to. That is the whole point of the direction the tear runs. So let me ask you something I actually want to know. Do you read the torn veil as the inner curtain before the most holy place, as the outer curtain with the heavens embroidered on it? Or do you think Matthew and Mark simply did not specify because their point did not depend on which one it was? Tell me which of the 3, and why. If it was the inner curtain, and if a priest was serving in there when it happened, then he had spent his whole life beside a piece of cloth he was not allowed to pass. And he may have been the first ordinary priest in the history of that building to see the forbidden room standing open. No gospel gives us his name, or what he did next, or whether he ever told anyone what he saw.